Hi everybody, it's me, Karen Holton, with a censorship warning. YouTube requires that we indicate that some opinions in this video may contradict the consensus medical opinion about COVID-19. So please don't believe everything you hear. Do your own independent research to find out what fits with you. And welcome to the show. Welcome to Convergence, Episode 3 on People for People Radio. Find out how the personal is political as we explore the politics here on Earth, the exopolitics of our galaxy and dimensions beyond, through my unique perspective. Join me for discussions about how social justice activism, ET activism, and spiritual transformation converge to bring in the new positive timeline. Today, we're going to cover the alternative political history of Canada, how politics are conducted in outer space, and a solution that worked for humans in the past. So welcome everybody. I'm going to start off today with some history of Canada. Now, I'm just going to let you know ahead of time, this is not a very nice history, but I think that if each of you went to your countries of origin and did the research, you might find very similar. And the reason I'm going through this information is so that to basically show folks that our governments, the established governments, have pretty much not had our best interests at heart. So it's up to us to find our own sovereignty and to introduce new ways of being and doing, creating a political arena that actually is works for everybody. So I want to start off a long time ago when the eugenics movement is alive and well in Canada, and it's been going from first contact right up to present. And I want everyone to know that pre-contact in Canada, there was already many populations of people here. They were intelligent, they were well organized, they had peaceful societies, and the population was probably larger than what it is today in Canada. And so the early colonists came to Canada and decided they wanted the rich resources. Basically, that was really what was happening. Now, they also spread religion, but the religion, again, only served a purpose that has to do with the elite class being able to have access to the resources that are here in Canada. And so there was already a very well-established community of different groups of people who, for the most part, got along. For the most part, formed alliances. They had good health. They had everything they needed to be healthy and happy. And of course, what happens is the colonizer goes in and destroys communities of people just to get the resources. And so the early colonists used basically two things to destabilize the communities and the indigenous populations here. They used religion and they used the Hudson's Bay Company. And I also want to add that they used alcohol, which was never actually part of the First Nations or the Aboriginal communities' way of eating or celebrating or anything like that. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the early settlement realities. So what happened was they moved in and they started coming to Canada, and they would not have lasted one single day if it wasn't for the kindness of the Aboriginal people, who did a number of things. They helped to translate between the newcomers and the different Indigenous populations. They acted as guides and they showed how to travel and where to travel so that the newer Canadians could do their map making and things like that. They also took Aboriginal wives for themselves, because what we were taught to refer to the colonizers as explorers. They weren't called what they really were in the early days, although they were doing a certain amount of exploring. They weren't just here to explore, not at all. And so they took First Nations wives, and these women were basically like slaves. They had to make a new pair of moccasins every day for the newcomers because they wore out while they were traveling, the terrain. They also, identified food sources and cooked for them, and they made it possible for the early explorers to actually travel into what is now known as Canada. And they couldn't, like I said, the Europeans would not have survived one single day if it wasn't for the kindness of the First Nations people. Now, as with everything, the hidden agendas of governments, ruling elites, etc., is always hidden. There's always hidden agendas. And so, of course, the First Nations and Aboriginal peoples were not told the truth about what was coming. They, I think, in their minds and from their culture, they were willing to share a certain amount of what they had with the newcomers. So very soon after that, a slave labor class was also imported, mostly from Europe, including French, Irish, and even Scottish women, who then lived on their homesteads or in the forts, or depending on where they lived. And they worked very, very hard to try to produce a European lifestyle for their husbands and, of course, have many, many children for them. So right from the beginning, the First Nations were targeted, they were tricked, and they were forced onto ever-shrinking reserves with Indian agents. So this would have been the First Nation or Aboriginal population's first exposure to institutional life, because once they were moved onto the reserves, they had to answer to the Indian agent. And the Indian agent, of course, was European and often part of the clergy or part of what we would consider government. And the Aboriginal people were not allowed to leave the reserves. They weren't allowed to do anything as far as farming, commerce, trade, socializing, celebrating, spirituality, nothing without the Indian agent's approval. And of course, the Indian agent was there to help with the genocide. So obviously, they were not allowed to do anything that was in their best interests, speaking of the First Nations people. So the next thing that happened was the spreading of disease by both clergy and the so-called explorers. I'll get into that a little bit later on. So there was an open and a deliberate plan to commit genocide against the native populations. And at the same time, there was an intensive propaganda program to scapegoat the First Nations people. So, for instance, the European people were taught that the First Nations people were savages, that they were ignorant, that they were dirty, that they spread disease, that they were like semi-retarded, like little children, and they didn't know how to do anything for themselves. So it's best to leave it to the elites to decide to keep them away from the European population. And the genocide in Canada was so successful that other UK nations came to learn how to deal with their Aboriginal populations from the Canadian model. And I'll give you an example. In South Africa, the Boers, which are actually Dutch people, they came to Canada to find out how Canada dealt with the First Nations populations. And they copied that and took it to South Africa, and they established apartheid. So apartheid is a direct copy of the Canadian policies for genocide against the First Nations people. Now, getting back a little bit forward in time towards us to the 18th and 19th centuries, residential schools were introduced by governments in 1831, and they were created by and administered by the clerics and the religions until 1996. That's over 165 years of consistently destroying these people's languages, culture, and the residential schools were actually predominantly death camps. It doesn't mean that everybody that went to them were severely abused, but for the most part, especially the children, they really were. And they were in a number of different ways. So first of all, they were purposely exposed to deadly diseases like tuberculosis, like smallpox. So what they did was they had the children visit the sanitariums and stay with the European sick people till they got sick, and then sent them back to the reserves where they then infected other children. Or sometimes they would do things like act like the government would act like they were so benevolent, and they'd supply blankets and supplies to the reserves. But these blankets and supplies came from the sanitariums, so they spread disease like crazy. As I mentioned, their language and their customs were erased. The children were used as sex tools, not just for visiting dignitaries, but even for the men and women who were supposed to be religious clerics and spiritual people. They were worked, starved, and beaten to death. And after World War II, they were used for medical experimentation by the Nazi scientists. Now, I'm not making any of this up. I graduated from the University of Victoria with a bachelor degree in 2004. And all of the information in this Canadian history that I am bringing to your attention to today was all taught to me through my university education from textbooks that were supplied by the University of Victoria. So I recommend that you all do your own research if you can find the accurate information anymore. So as I mentioned, there was heavy propaganda to further stigmatize the First Nations people, because to be quite honest, the common European descent people were capable of some compassion. They would have realized that what was going on was very wrong, and I'm sure they would have had an opportunity to express their discontent and possibly even side with their First Nations brothers and sisters if they had actually known about what was going on. So I want to draw your attention to a reference which is not available to Canadians. This is a website that is outlawed in Canada, but you might be able to access it. And it is murderbydecree.com. Murderbydecree.com. And I'll put the link for those of you who are watching this on YouTube. I'll put the link in the description box below. So as I mentioned, First Nations populations were kept from integrating with the mainstream population. And later on, the rumors got even worse. And they told us about this ideal native life, and they completely elevated the tension and the prejudice between the European descendants and the First Nations people. And I'll give an example. In my day, we were always taught that the First Nations people were kind of ignorant and stupid, refused to be taught. They were given vast tracts of the best land in Canada. They didn't have to pay any income tax. They had the best of medical care and everything, but they just squandered it. And the beautiful homes that were given to them by the government, they just trashed them. So anytime we saw film footage or evidence of the horribly abysmal conditions on many reserves, we would go, oh, well, that's the Indians' fault. They went and trashed everything because they're savages. That was what we were taught. We never saw any evidence to the contrary. I never knew about the true history of the First Nations people until I went to university. So obviously this is forbidden information and difficult to find. So I also want to mention that the conditions were so terrible that I think a lot of people would have a hard time even comprehending that those conditions would be there. And even today, there are many reserves where people don't have access to adequate housing. They still don't even have fresh water, which is a basic human right. So this has been going on all through history. This has been going on. Oh, this is one of Canada's dirty little secrets. So now I want to talk a little bit about the continued slave market of non-Aboriginal people in Canada. And the first thing I want to mention is the rule of thumb. Now, rule of thumb is taken from Canadian law history, and many people will go, oh, well, do this or that, you know, rule of thumb. But they don't realize where that expression comes from. So in Canada, until the late 1800s, it was not only permissible to beat your wife and your children, it was actually legislated. It was actually built into Canadian history. And women and children had no rights, and they couldn't own any property, and they couldn't own anything else. And the husband was supposed to beat his wife if she displeased him, and beat his children. But the object that he was beating them with could not be wider than the man's thumb. That's where the law drew the line. In addition, any man could put his woman out, and she would have no legal recourse ever to try to get her access to her children, or perhaps some of her belongings that had been passed down, say perhaps from her mother. Nothing like that. She'd just get turned out. And so women lived under a great deal of fear and oppression, even within the European homes. Birth control was outlawed, and so women gave birth until they died, pretty much. And there were a few elites, and there were the white and the Métis slave class, which served them. So we see that even happening today. So what happened was you had the elites, and they had the big houses, they had the power, they had everything they wanted, pretty much. And so the children that were born to the regular women who were imported to Canada and took European husbands. Well, before that, they had the First Nations wives, and then as soon as they started importing poorer women from other European countries, they just all dumped their First Nations wives and took on white wives, French, Irish, Scottish, and some English. And so, they're having children, and then what did the children do? Well, there was not work for all of them, and so they had to go into service. They had to go service at the big houses that the white people had. Now, this is very, very similar to the slave class in the southern United States, where you had the big plantations, you had the managers, you had the owner and his wife, and it was all slave labor. Well, the same thing happened in Canada to the European immigrant people. And so many of them basically some of them sold their children into service, but quite often young people and children, still children as we would consider them today, would go into these wealthy homes and do service work. So they would do the cleaning and the washing up and the cooking and all the jobs, because the ladies of that day didn't lift a finger. That was considered beneath them. And so what happened was a lot of sexual abuse. And so if you worked in one of these big houses and you were being sexually abused by the master or the overseer or the manager or a staff person who had more clout than what you did, you were sexually abused, and they didn't have birth control, and so these young women would get pregnant. So what would they do? First of all, they couldn't let society know, or they would become outcasts. They would have no work, they'd have no way to provide for themselves, and no so-called upright man would want them. The other thing is, if they went to the lady of the house, she would have them thrown out, because she would rather throw out innocent young women than admit that her husband is a pervert and an abuser. And so what happened is these women would get pregnant, and then when it was time to give birth, they would go out somewhere secluded on the farm or on the plantation or in the woods or wherever they could find a little bit of privacy. They would have their babies, and then they would strangle them and bury them and go back to work. That was the only option for European women who were imported to become wives, and for the successive generations who weren't lucky enough to be wealthy elites. Another one of Canada's dirty little secrets. They have found mass grave sites in the older cities, towns, not to mention nunneries and monasteries and things like that. So you would think that things would be getting better as we move towards our time. But what happened was the Industrial Revolution. And then what happened is factories. And the factories became the new death camps. People of both genders were not paid enough to have decent food or clothing or housing. Men, women, and children worked 6 or 7 days a week, often 12 hours a day. No wonder they all died by the time they were 40. Then you have the evolution of the Canadian medical industry. So they created what they call the cult of the true woman. All the women who were elite, all the women who were important, had high status. They were able to pay doctors. Now, before this, there really wasn't any doctors. Everybody used plant-based medicine. And there was extremely valuable plant-based medicine and ways of healing that the Aboriginal people had. But they were all tucked away on the reserves, barely surviving, with generation after generation after generation of abuse. So that what happened was a lot of their sacred ways of knowing and being and healing were lost. And the elites wanted that so they could become doctors, so that the elite sons could become doctors. This was a whole new way of looking at medicine. And they practiced being doctors because it was unregulated, of course, at the time, not saying it's great regulated today. And they would cut people. So they would take people of color, and they would just keep them as slaves and prisoners, and they would practice their surgery on these people. Now, these people, they had no anesthetic. They did not have hygienic conditions. And here they are out in the shed getting operated on by some guy who wants to be a doctor because there was great social status in being a doctor. And it was absolutely, absolutely disgusting. Now, there was a completely different rule when it came to poor women. So everybody believed at the time that poor women didn't feel pain. Poor women could be worked to death and be destroyed from having baby after baby, and that was okay, because poor women were not like rich women. They didn't feel pain, they didn't suffer, they were tough. And so the cult of the true woman led the elite women to believe that they were extremely fragile. Well, what they really were was wearing corsets and they couldn't breathe. But besides that, they weren't allowed to have anything that was popular within the male domain. So here they are, bored as crazy, wearing these corsets. They got all these rules they have to follow of etiquette and everything else that goes along with being one of the elites. And they had lots of money to pay these doctors who came in and gave them all kinds of toxic things, all kinds of cruel treatments. Oh my gosh, what they went through with childbirth under the brutality of this newly emerging medical industry. So as I mentioned, the rich, they had the funds to keep the doctors in business, and the poor did not. So the poor were considered, didn't need doctors, only rich women and rich people needed doctors. And as we move forward in history, it actually gets in some ways just as bad, if not worse. Children were brought over from the UK to serve as child labor. Many children were sexually abused, starved, and worked to death. And what's really interesting is during that time period, a horse was worth more than a low-status person or a child. They came up with the SPCA, which stands for the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and that was around the late 1800s, early 1900s. And those established laws were used later on in history, meaning closer to our time. They were used to protect children. So children were then basically in the courts, it was proven that children were at least equal to animals, and now some child protection laws started to be applied, but not very much. And I mean, who are you going to go and tell? Who are you going to tell? The elites are always believed above the common people. And I'm sure whatever country you're in right now, you could go into your historical databases and find that this has actually all happened in your country, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in Scotland, you know, probably most of the world. So getting back to this, a horse was considered of more value than a child. Well, I would add to that, or a person of color. Children had no rights, and in many respects, they still do not. Child labor, child sex trade, facilitated often by the very social services who are supposed to protect children, still goes on today. Children faced unlawful incarceration, and they were prey for all kinds of cults, and that is still true today. I myself, when I was 15 years old, I got a ride with a girlfriend of mine from a couple of guys, and we went from BC to Alberta to visit my grandmother. Her husband, who is not my grandfather, called the police to find out what to do about us, and they put us in maximum security detention. And I was in there for about 2 weeks, and I actually started to have some psychological problems because I knew no one knew I was in there. So I went and I talked to one of the guards. Her name was Mrs. Pepperdine, bless her heart. And I guess she looked into it, and the next thing I knew, I was on a plane back home. And so what I'm saying is that they still can pick up children, put them in maximum security, and nobody knows they're there. That is still happening today. You're going to say, how could that happen? Well, it happens. All kinds of things happen. But of course, you're not going to read about it in the newspaper. And then one other thing I want to say is in my day, and it was about the 1970s, the Queen of England, the Queen who's Queen today, came to visit British Columbia, which is a province in Canada. And she went, and the Queen's entourage requested that 10 children go from one of the residential schools with them on a picnic. And none of those 10 children were ever seen again. So to back that up, go to murderbydegree.com and take a look at the evidence because it's all there. So then I want to move into some of the racist policies of the 20th century. People from Asia were permitted to immigrate if they were single males and could work on establishing the railroad, and many, many, many of them died. And an example of that is the Chinese head tax, which was a fixed fee charged to each Chinese person entering Canada. They all came in through Victoria, British Columbia at the time. The head tax was first levied after the Canadian Parliament passed the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, which stipulated that all Chinese people entering Canada must first pay a $50 fee, later referred to as a head tax, with a fee increasing to $100 in 1900 and later to its maximum of $500 in 1903. And it was meant to discourage Chinese people from entering Canada after the railroad, the Canadian Pacific Railroad, or CPR, was completed. Now, $100 in 1900, I don't know what that is, but it may as well have been $1 million because it prevented all kinds of immigration from China. And immigration from India. Early immigration to Canada was met with much hostility in British Columbia because a lot of non-European or non-white people or people of color all came in through Victoria, British Columbia. As a result of this, East Indian immigration to Canada decreased dramatically until the 1940s. Only after the First World War did Canada change its position on East Indian immigration and allowed the admission of women and children. But there was a catch. They had other restrictions were applied, such as the continuous voyage regulation of 1908. So what happened was they said, oh yes, we will allow immigration from India, but you have to have a continuous voyage. So you have to have a ship that goes directly from India to Canada, or you have to find a plane or a flight to take you directly from India to Canada. Otherwise, you can't immigrate. Well, guess what? There were no flights that were direct from India to Canada. There were no ships that voyaged from India directly to Canada. And so that made restricted the immigration of people of color. People of color who immigrated to Canada were also restricted to service jobs and businesses like shopkeepers, restaurants, laundry, and other low-level service jobs. And even today, many new Canadians that have told me personally that they had high-level positions such as doctors and lawyers, etc., before they immigrated. But when they came to Canada, they were only allowed to do security, janitorial, and other service jobs. So now I want to move a little bit into today's racism. So unless we're part of the upper echelon class, we are all expendable crew members today. We all face genocide of the human population. And the transhumanist agenda, if we cooperate with it, we are going to be digitally lobotomized through what they call CRISPR technology that will be administered through vaccination, and we're clearly seeing that today. So I continue to say that the Canadian government has never had the best interests of the common people at heart. That has never happened. And that has happened almost nowhere in the whole world if you want to peek behind the veil and take a look. I know that this is some pretty hard information, hard for some of you to swallow, but my intention here is not to turn you anti-Canadian, it's not to turn you against your government, it's not to upset you, it's to open your eyes so that you can see what is happening in the world, and would our governments actually do what all the conspiracies are actually claiming? And I would say absolutely, based on the evidence, they absolutely would do that. So now, for contrast, I want to switch over a little bit to the politics of intergalactic people. Now, I know some of you are rolling your eyes, and that's totally okay. This stuff is not easy for a lot of people to accept. And I'm not asking you to accept it. I'm just going to show you a little bit of a contrast to how things are done in outer space. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, Karen, how the hell would you know what's going on in outer space? Well, believe it or not, I'm actually an exopolitical ambassador. What I do is I attend meetings on a massive, massive ship, what we would consider a spaceship. And it's even bigger than the United States. And it has populations from many worlds. And they have worked out ways of doing things that are very different than the way we do things here on Earth. And I don't care if you believe me or not, that's not my point. My point is I want to show you there are other ways of doing things. There are ways of working. And the first thing I want to say about these off-world groups is that they're autonomous. It means that they have personal sovereignty and their communities have sovereignty. When you have sovereignty, you take responsibility of every aspect of your life, the good you've done, the not so good that you've done, everything. You take responsibility and you become the person you choose to become. And yes, I'm going to use the term person because our intergalactic brothers and sisters look very much like us, and they are people in every sense of the word. The other thing I want to talk about, their politics is everything is tied up in politics. So let me just say, first of all, they don't use language. Language is something that's given to us by the construct, and we're forced to live within that language structure. And we express ourselves with words that were given to us without really even realizing what the roots of these words are. And words are very much components of spells. That's why you call it spelling. And words get in the way because they severely limit the conceptual arena that we're all capable of. So in outer space, what happens is everybody uses telepathy. It's the best way to communicate because there is no language barrier. And when we communicate when we're in outer space, we use telepathy, but not a transmission of words. We communicate by using a combination of things. Visual images that we see in our mind's eye. We use feelings, which are like overall body sensations, very much the way our intuition communicates with us here on Earth today. They also have, it also includes emotion. And it includes other things that I don't have English language for. And all of that comes together and forms a communication system that is not only very effective, it's very transparent. So you can't be a liar. You can't be a deceiver. You can't be somebody who bullies other people because everyone will know about it. It's like being naked. And everybody knows what everybody else is what they're about. And so there's no deception. And so that allows for a tremendous amount of health and freedom. And the other thing they do in outer space is they don't use money. There's no such thing as a money-based economy. They don't even have a concept for it. Everything is free. Everything is available to everybody. And when you're done with it, it gets recycled into something else or it goes to someone else. It's an amazing system. It's so amazing that I've decided in next week's show, I'm going to start by going over the Intergalactic Resettlement Program. I want to tell you about my background. I want to tell you how I got involved in this kind of work, how I ended up doing it, how it happened for me, and so much more about our intergalactic brothers and sisters. And again, it doesn't matter if you believe me or not. That's not my intention. But I want to show you a glimpse into another way of conducting a political arena that's actually good for people, that actually works. And it is absolutely amazing. I'm just going to read one of the comments here. It's from Carlene. Hi, Carlene. Oh, you're amazing. I want to have you on one of my shows one of these days very soon. She said, this is the only planet that we are charged to live, LOL. And she says, absolutely, there is nothing to hide. And I would agree with that. Thank you, Carlene. And so next week, I'm going to start on going into more detail about that. So the other thing is, and what's hidden in our common knowledge or in our history as we've been served it up is, yes, there have been communities here on Earth who did have systems that were egalitarian, that did have systems that worked very, very well. And especially amongst the Aboriginal populations, which the elites have done a very good job of basically eliminating, and all the goodness that came from that, which would be their ways of knowing, their spirituality, the ways they conducted their communities. They were very cooperative. Often many different nations would come under one heading so that they could have like councils and work out their issues. That there's tons and tons of evidence of that, and going back for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And one group that I want to talk about is, it's a very interesting concept, and this is what happened in what we consider to be ancient Israel. So in ancient Israel, they had a system called the Jubilee. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I actually kind of really like the sound of this system. So what they did was, in the beginning, everybody owned everything. So everything was portioned out. Everybody had land. Everybody had resources, access to resources. Everybody had access to gold, silver, whatever. They had access to all of it. Now, some people are thinking, oh, that sounds like communism. Well, I just have a quick word to say about communism. I'm not for or against any political party here on Earth. I'm an exopolitics kind of girl. And after you've experienced that, it's pretty hard to wedge yourself inside that little box of Earth politics again. But I want to say that what's being passed off as communism today is actually state capitalism. And what's being passed off as democracy today is actually state capitalism. And if you do the research, you will see that what I'm about to say has really nothing to do with communism. So anyway, what happened was everybody got the land, all got apportioned out to everybody. The resources got apportioned out to everybody. And then it was like ready, set, go. Everybody went on and lived their lives. If you were somebody who was pretty good with money and investments, you could end up a very wealthy person. If you were someone who was really smart for, say, social planning, you could become a pretty important person. And there's lots of things you could do to increase your wealth, but then again, that wealth is coming from the pots belonging to other people. And so if someone was not very smart, or I guess I should say didn't make very good investments, or if they squandered their money, or if they got involved in addictions, or if they, or even if they just had a natural disaster and they lost their resources, they could then sell themselves as slaves into these wealthier communities and work off their debt, or work their way back into another position. I mean, there's millions and millions of ways of living and dealing with resources. And so every 50 years, there was a reset. Every 50 years, everything got canceled, everything got returned back to everybody, and they started all over again. And that happened every 50 years. So you wouldn't have situations, well, I guess, I was going to say Bill Gates, but that's not a very good comparison. But you wouldn't have people who just become so wealthy and then they pass that on through inheritance, you know, to their firstborn. And you get that ugly situation that comes along with monarchies and things like that. You didn't have any of that. And so what happened is every 50 years, everything got reset. Everybody started over again. So if you were very young at a reset point, or what they called the Jubilee, you know, and for whatever reason you became extremely wealthy or you became extremely poor, when you're about 50 years old, there was a reset and you got to start all over again. Hopefully by then you learned something. So I'm not saying, oh yes, let's all go out and do the Jubilee. I am saying there are other ways of organizing people and resources that actually are much fairer than the systems that we see today. And again, what's happened today is too big really for me to even talk about. But I do want to say that there are, sorry about that. There are other ways of doing things. And just in summary, I want to say that since history is written by the victors, It's important to consider the alternative history as told by the disadvantaged in order to get a more complete perspective of the politics of Earth. And I'm sure that every country, as we know it today, has faced similar circumstances which have been hidden behind the official narrative. We've been brainwashed and confined in our thinking and opportunities in life, and it is good to expand our consciousness by considering the ways that things are done off-world. And in this way, we can make the shift to healthier politics that support diversity, ancient wisdoms and technologies, and decide for ourselves how we wish to manifest our own sovereignty. And as I mentioned last week, disadvantaged people all over the globe and all throughout history have been forced to evolve by coping with political, social, and economic pressures. And as a result, the common people become smarter, more creative, and innovative. And those who are multi-generational survivors form a great army of resilient beings. And so don't give up hope. Don't give up hope. Things are changing, and they're changing really fast. What we want to do is take really good care of ourselves so that we're in the best shape possible so that we can participate in the exchange of what's coming, hopefully sooner rather than later. So in conclusion, I encourage everyone to drop any official narratives that we've been holding on to and to do some research into the alternative histories of the people in our countries and make room for some new, healthier ways of living, interacting, and sharing this beautiful planet and solar system found within a very well-organized and peaceful galaxy. So as I mentioned, next week, exopolitics and the intergalactic resettlement program. I do hope you can make it for that. Okay, I have a few more minutes. Is there any questions from the audience? I could take them now. That would be great. And if not, I'll just continue. It was a real eye-opener for me when I went to university. I can't tell you. What I did was I took all the fringe courses that interested me so that I could find out what the alternative narratives were, so that I could find out all the things that you just never hear about in common conversation. And I studied, oh, thank you, Carlene. And so I studied very hard, and I took all kinds of courses in sociology and psychology and alternative history and all those kinds of things. And it was a real eye-opener for me, and it actually helped me to wake up. What was really interesting is the actual course that I took. I got a degree in social work. But because I didn't specialize in child apprehension or protection, I didn't specialize in First Nation studies, I took a very generalist approach. What happened was when it came time for me to get out and work in the real world, the type of agencies that were offering positions did not want to hear anything about all the alternative information that I was learning or that I knew, or the ways of being and doing that I was aware of. And a really good example of that was I took every course that was possible to be an addictions counselor. So I studied addictions all around the world. And I found that pretty much all the different ways that they were dealing with addictions in the world didn't work. The only thing that worked was a harm reduction program. And I was so inspired by that, I started to apply harm reduction in my work, in my life, in my messages, in everything. Because harm reduction, it's not about perfection. In fact, what does that word even mean? Depending on who you're talking to, perfection could have a very different look. And so instead, we work on harm reduction. So we do the very best we can with what we have. And And so that was another thing that I learned there. But I also am going to tell you that what was super interesting is this information that I gave you today. When I went out into the social arena, when I went out and mixed with other people, if I talked about any of this, I was immediately shut down. Nobody wanted to hear it. And again, as I mentioned in the last show or the show before that, I was involved in all kinds of political activism, even forming a social justice group, all kinds of things. We did everything by the book. We tried to bring about change by contacting government officials, educating people, bugging the heck out of the different officials, embarrassing the officials by exposing what was really going on. The conditions that are happening today didn't just start last year, didn't start in Wuhan with a virus. This was carefully planned 10, 20, even longer years ago. And so those of us that got involved in social justice, we did everything possible. And we just got viewed as being crazy people. We just got shut down. If we participated like in different kinds of protests, peaceful protests, things like that, some of us received terrible brutality from the police, very similar to what you're seeing happen in Canada today over the restrictions. This has been going on and on and on. And what happened is many of us just got burnt right out and went, what's the point of doing it? And it wasn't until I had my spiritual transformation that I realized the change had to start within myself. The change had to start within me. And as I changed, my personal relationships changed. As my health changed, I started to see things differently. And it filters out from within. You start pretty much everything by going within, not by going without. And by going within, we clean up our bodies, we're able to hold more frequency, we become more reliable, more likable people, and we're able to share that with others. And we're able to actually change our reality. And I'm telling you, it works like magic. It is uncanny how well it works. I'll give you an example. Just pick a day, any day, and decide, today I'm going to be more patient with people. Or today I'm going to do a random act of kindness. Or today I'm going to pray for someone I don't even know. And you just start doing little things within your own personal arena, and things start to shift and things start to change. And relationships that you didn't think would ever come to anything start to happen. And so that can start to happen within your own family, because when you change within yourself, your family dynamic changes and the health of your family changes. And so suddenly you're having rewarding relationships instead of a lot of stress, excuse me, and tension. And that starts to happen, and people start to open up to love and respect. And then they start to change in the different constellations of relationships that they have as they go out into the world. And pretty soon your communities start to change. And that's how we're going to change this world, by changing ourselves. So looking out and pointing a finger and saying, dirty, rotten government. Well, I guess even I do some of that. But at the same time, then we go, okay, I can't do anything about him or her. I know, I've tried. I've been in social justice for many years, and I couldn't bring about the kind of change I wanted to see. But when I had my spiritual transformation and I wanted to become a better Karen, I wanted to become a better Karen for a lot of reasons. For one reason, I wasn't really sure what to believe about after I die, because I don't know anyone who's really come back to tell me, oh, there are some people who channel for different souls. And now in my life and in my own experience, I am able to communicate with some souls and find out. But essentially, I've never seen a live person say, yeah, I was dead and this is what happened. Oh, whoops, I guess I shouldn't say that, because there are people who've had near-death experiences. But basically, at that point in time, I didn't know what to believe. So I thought, Okay, let's take a look at this. If there's nothing happens after I die, if I'm just dead and the worms eat me and that's the end of Karen, I want to live a life well examined. I want to live a life that when it's my time to pass over, I feel good about my life. I feel good about the things I've learned, and I feel good about my intentions towards myself and other people. If reincarnation is real, I want to be able to come back and have a better life. There's no way I'm going to come back and do this shit over again. So I better get it right this time around. Then I thought, well, if there's a heaven and if there's a hell, well, I don't think any kind of a loving God is going to punish me for doing my absolute best. I don't think so. And so I decided the best thing that I could do was to improve myself. And I can't tell you the changes that have happened for me and have made my life truly miraculous and really, truly amazing. Now, if you would like to enjoy more of my content, please check out my website at www.karenholtonhealthcoach.com, where you will find an abundance of free resources to assist with energetic ascension into physical, mental, and spiritual paradise. Excuse me. You will find there the 9 steps to quantum health transformation. This is a free, no strings attached, comprehensive online lifestyle course. It's the very same system that I have used and used myself. And I got that program in a download. I can't even take credit for it. I can only take credit for actually producing the 20+ videos that are going to give you insight into yourself and how to create a more rewarding life. Also, the Quantum Guide Show, interviews with awakened masters. Let them share their quantum work with you. I also host the Forbidden Transformation Show with Karen and Chris. Learn how to make positive ET contact, improve your life, and find your experiencer community. Join us. And then, of course, the Fringe View. Science fiction becomes science fact as you learn about my real life, paranormal, and extraterrestrial experiences. And if you'd like to support my work, please check out my online shop where you will find Zendome's Orgonite, my unique brand of orgone generators, ethically sourced, handmade, and double charged for maximum effect. Comfort crystals. I have a limited collection of energetically infused semi-precious stones for sale. I also offer lifestyle services, which include workshops, assessments, and of course, one-on-one support and counseling. And I have PDF downloads, which are printable, shareable copies of my lessons. And so my website again is www.karenholtonhealthcoach.com. That's KarenHolton healthcoach.com. You can email me if you have any questions or if you have some suggestions on future content at forbiddentransformation@gmail.com. And of course, you can reach me here on People for People Radio, www.peopleforpeople.ning.com. And you can also check out my YouTube channel, which is at www.youtube.com/C/Karen Holton TV. So my YouTube channel is called Karen Holton TV. And I'd like to give a warm thank you to Gaz and Vanessa. Without you, I wouldn't be here. Without you, I wouldn't have a show. I very much appreciate all of your patience and your kind consideration. It's just been a lovely experience so far, and I'm looking forward to many, many, many more shows like this one. And so I wish all of you much love, much peace, much wisdom, and I hope you get some laughter in there too, because joy is just such an amazing lubricant to help us to fit into this rational society, or irrational, depending on how you look at it, that we all live in. Thank you everybody so much for joining me today.